So I did want to say a few words about crowdfunding. I mean, how are we doing for time here?
We're fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it a brave new world, a new horizon? Who knows? The crowdsourcing, the difference between crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, I've often been asked, sometimes been asked. Okay, somebody asked me once. What's the difference? And the answer is crowdsourcing is what Kickstarter does. Basically, you're finding a bunch of people to buy your product that you haven't yet manufactured, or sign up for your service that you're not yet in a position to provide, and to prepay for the goods and services. They're not getting an investment in your company. They're just saying, that's a great idea, here's a check, send me one of whatever it is you're going to do later. Or, and there are variations on that. So for example, for small winery companies who've raised money to buy equipment or using Kickstarter, they can't sell alcohol because of the rules related to the sale of alcohol, but you can give a t-shirt and a corkscrew away in exchange for the money. And that's essentially all you're doing. You're just giving something away that is not an investment in your company. And Kickstarter has had a lot of press, a lot of publicity. It's been very good for a lot of people. Indiegogo, which has been typically for more artistic projects, music, film have used Indiegogo, where people are essentially, providing money to help the project, and they're getting a credit on it as a named investor, or they're getting a t-shirt and a poster or something like that, or a free CD, and that's what they're essentially doing. I had a client who needed to redesign one of their products, and the tooling cost was like $30,000 for the tooling. They put it out on Kickstarter because it was a product that they sold for a lot of consumers bought, and they put it out on Kickstarter. They raised $100,000 just so they could do the tooling. And people just said, okay, and when you've got the product, ship me one, or two, or three, however many you did. It was very successful. So that's crowdsourcing. Crowdfunding is where you're basically looking for people to invest in your company. And at the present time, it's illegal, unless you can comply with the securities laws. So this whole sort of web-based community that is going to invest in your company, it's not allowed to do it at the present time.
Unless they're accredited, right?
Unless they're accredited. So the Jobs Act that came in 2012 opened up a pilot, or the ability to do general solicitation of accredited investors in an online fashion. And the first one has just been approved, and that's going out. But you do have to make sure that these people are accredited, and you have to have, it's a process like we talked about before, making sure that the people are accredited in fact. But the SEC has approved the first one recently. It was a couple of weeks ago, so that's good. But the big...
Is there a limit on investors?
No. The beauty of accredited is there's no limit on the number of investors. There's just a limit on who they are. Inviting the general public to participate, which is the great, everybody believes is going to be the new tomorrow, is not yet permitted. This has been going on outside the US for several years. There's a company in the Netherlands called Simbid, which is actually a weird form of cooperative that you invest in. You become a member of a cooperative. In the UK, they have a very successful company called Crowdcube, which has been doing this for about 3 or 4 years. In the UK, the rules are a little different. If you invest in a private company that qualifies, in other words, it's not a real estate company, basically. If it's a manufacturing company or something of that nature, then you get a tax deduction for the amount of money you invest, and then you get a break on the capital gains if you sell the stock in the company. So and that program has been around in the UK since the early 90s, that basic tax regime, and now it's layered into an online community. Australia has had it for 7 years, I think, and so US, somewhat surprisingly, is a long way behind this. The Jobs Act came in 2012. It always makes me laugh, and you're going to laugh further. The Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act is what it stands for. And apparently there is somebody in, whoever is the congressional staffer for whoever is the person promoting the legislation, whose job it is to come up with an acronym for all these things. So we do have the crowdfunding exemption, and I can never remember what this is. The crowdfunding exemption, so remember crowdfund, which stands for Capital Raising Online While Deterring Fraud and Unethical Non-Disclosure Act. Really? I met the person who promoted the legislation in Congress at a conference last year, and he was telling me, he said, kid you not, you go in and said, this is what we should call it, and somebody's job was to figure out what they should call it so it's spelled crowdfund. There you go. So we have it. It's been the law since April of last year. The SEC was supposed to produce rules by the end of last year, and as epic fail on their part not to do so. I think the fact that Mary Shapiro, who was the chairman of the SEC, wrote a 7-page letter to Congress the week before it was passed into law saying, don't do it, didn't help. And then she's been replaced by Mary White, who is basically a prosecutor and not a regulator, so it'll be interesting to see how she gets her head around this concept. So I'm just going to...
So what does that mean if it's in law, but we have to wait for the SEC to...
You can't... You have to wait for rules. The law requires the SEC to make rules so that you know what to do and how to do it. But the law provides the framework within which the rules must then operate. So we have the framework. And the other great thing about the crowdfunding exemption is it's like the accredited investor exemption. If your investor is accredited, then you're within a federal exemption. You don't have to worry about state securities laws. It's marvelous. And the same thing with the crowdfunding exemption. If you can get your offering to fit within the exemption, you don't have to worry about any of the states. And that's a great thing. It was a great start to the legislation. Companies are limited to raising $1 million in any 12-month period through crowdfunding. People are not, the amount that they can invest is limited. So if you earn less than, or your net worth is less than $100,000, you can't invest more than $2,000 or 5% of your net income.
Whichever is less.
Whichever is less. If you're over 100,000 of net worth, then it's 10% of your income or net worth. No, it's the greater. I'm sorry, beg your pardon. It is the greater of those numbers. I have no idea how they're going to track that. But on the same basis, that how do they track somebody who says he's an accredited investor? The way we track it is we send you a questionnaire. We ask you to fill in a form that says yes, 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 yes. We ask you to sign it, and then when you invest, we ask you to sign another representation that says yes, I am in fact accredited. And the law at the present time only requires you to take reasonable steps to ensure that the person is accredited. And if you do that, you're considered to have taken reasonable steps, unless of course you knew that the person wasn't. So usually the best thing to do is not ask too many questions if people are prepared to sign it. How they're going to track this on an annual basis with members of the public, I have no idea, and I don't suppose the SEC does either, and that's probably one of the reasons why we don't have anything.
That net worth is exclusive of your own residence, right?
Well, it is for accredited investors. We don't know what it's going to be for ordinary investors. It doesn't say in the legislation, at least I don't believe it says that. I can check. I think the residents might be included. I have it here. I'd have to check that. I can't remember. Yeah, I was really on top of this about a year ago, and then nothing's happened. So.
Well, I remember when you did the one last spring.
We didn't really know.
You expected that they would have regulations by before the election.
Yeah, exactly. But we didn't. So now, one of the reasons why Facebook went public was that there was a rule that said if you have more than 500 shareholders, you have to file the same documents with the SEC as if you were public. And so, you know, that's a giant expense, and you haven't got the benefit of liquidity in the stock. You might as well just go public, and that was one of the reasons why Facebook went public, because they had all of these people who were shareholders. One of the things that, and that limit has now been increased to 2,000 under the Jobs Act. One of the things that was concerning to a lot of people when the crowdfunding came up was that, well, we may get, you know, 2,000 people investing in our company. I mean, who knows how many people? And so what the legislation says is, okay, the limit is 2,000 before you have to file the public information about your company. But you can ignore anybody who invested through the crowdfunding. So you could have 500 people who invest normally and 3,000 people who invest through crowdfunding, and you're still under the 2,000 limit because you can just ignore all the crowdfunding people. Okay, we'll take it. You're going to have to pre-register with the SEC if you want to do crowdfunding. You're going to have to fill in a bunch of forms and provide them with information. You're going to have to use what's called a funding portal, which is an organization who is going to have to be approved by the SEC, regulated by some other SRA like FINRA or NASD, who is going to essentially act as the gatekeeper for the funds. They're going to put up the investment opportunity, they're going to collect the money, make sure it doesn't get dispensed before they've reached the target, and they're essentially acting like an escrow agent. One of the concerns that they have is that the SEC is very concerned to ensure that the portal doesn't act as the promoter of the offering. So in other words, they're not incentivized to go out and find people to invest. They're supposed to be one step removed. They're not the commission salesman for the project. So they're trying to keep them honest, essentially. It's not clear to me how these guys are going to get paid for the services that they're going to provide. We'll find out when the rules come out. But the portal is not allowed to invest. They can't have any of their people invest in the route. They have to be completely arm's length to the company. You're going to have to provide a bunch of information about the company, what you're planning to use the money for, how much you're going to raise, what the threshold is before you can take any of the money. And the SEC rulemaking is going to lay that out. Hopefully they do not go overboard like they have done in the past.
Does that apply both to Kickstarter and Indiegogo?
No, these are unregulated activities. Those activities are merely regulated by those companies. So they set the rules and you just have to comply with their rules. Kickstarter has, I think, tightened up. I think they came in for some criticism for some of the things like the Cube, which was that watch, the Apple Watch. People were going to have an iWatch or whatever the equivalent was, where they raised like $10 million and still not delivered a product. So I think Kickstarter is looking at this a little bit more critically and saying we won't let you go up unless you've got a prototype that we can actually see. So one of the concerns in the legislation was it said that if you are raising more than $100,000 and less than between $100,000 and $500,000, you had to have financial statements for the company that were reviewed by an independent CPA firm. And that's kind of an expensive process to do, particularly if you're in an early stage company. There was a lot of criticism that that level was too low, but it is what's written into the legislation. If you're going to raise more than $500,000 through this process, then you actually have to have audited financial statements. Now, the SEC in the legislation has the power to take that limit up, the $500,000 limit up, but it doesn't seem to have the ability to increase the 1 to 500,000 limit, or to remove that requirement for reviewed financials. So it's, I guess the CPA lobby got something out of this. And as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty about how commissions are going to work with the funding portals, because a lot of people do get paid based on what they raise, and it's unclear as to how the portals are going to be compensated, whether it's just sort of flat fee or whether it can be in any way linked to the amount of money raised. It's a big uncertainty. So,
and the 1 million cap seems to be, like you mentioned, there, on Kickstarter you have projects that capture millions
oh yeah,
to 10. So this cap of a million also kind of,
it's a start.
yeah.
Who knows how many people are going to take advantage of this. You've got to start somewhere. And what the people who promoted the legislation, who I met at a conference last year, were saying was basically, they came into Congress, they found the sponsors in the Congress, and they were basically said, look, we think this is a great idea, we need to get it on the books, there's going to be a lot of pushback, so let's not try to be overly ambitious, okay? If you go for 5 million or big numbers, you just never get past anything. So just don't be greedy. We'll negotiate where we can negotiate, but there are going to be certain things that you just can't push back against. Once we've got the legislation on the books, then you can get Congress to increase the limits. That's easy. Well, it's not easy, but it's a lot easier than trying to push through something that doesn't, might get more pushback.
Now, what about, as with your previous comment about foreign investment, if there are these foreign crowdsourced?
Well, no, foreign entities specifically cannot use the crowdfunding exemption. So if you're a foreign company, you can't invest.
Now I'm going the other direction. If I as a company can access foreign investors, as you were describing at the beginning, can I access foreign crowdsourced investors?
Well, that depends on the laws of the state, the laws of the country where you're trying to do it. So
Well, like the Dutch one you're saying, there's one in Holland that has
exactly
that system. Could I get?
I don't know.
Okay.
But I know for a fact that in the UK, as a US corporation, the UK CrowdCube won't take you if you are an American company.
Gotcha. But so that depends again on
that's right.
the
you
foreign rules, not on
correct.
the US rules.
Exactly. You wouldn't qualify, for example, for an investor investing in a US company won't get the tax relief because you're investing outside the UK for obvious reasons. So why would you get tax relief? So that's not going to work. Like everything, there are, be careful what you wish for moments, and with crowdfunding is no exception. There are a lot of practical implications that are going to need people are going to need to think through. If you're going to have, even if you have 100 investors, it's a lot of people to keep track of, and managing investors is potentially a full-time job for somebody. I have a client, it's a medical device company, We managed to not raise any institutional money. We've raised $16 million from individuals, and it's all done on a word-of-mouth basis. We have 138 shareholders, I think, at the present time. It's a lot of people to communicate with on a regular basis. So you have to have an annual meeting. So what happens if they all show up? They don't all show up. But you have to kind of plan for this. I want to communicate electronically with them. You can only communicate with these people electronically if they consent to that. So if somebody won't, you have to use snail mail. The way the legislation is set up is that there is going to be a cooling off period. So once you've sent in your money to the funding portal, there's going to be a period in which you can change your mind. And then get your money back. And that's one of the things the funding portal is going to have to be a guardian of, is the cooling off period. So there's going to be a lot of management issues with large numbers of shareholders. With all of these people come different risks. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the directors and officers insurance market does with this. Will they actually issue policies? I've got, most of the time you've got 15, 20 investors. They'll write the policy because all these people. They're not going to sue you. Well, now you've got 2,000 people, none of whom know you, and there's bound to be at least one psycho out there. So what is the D&O insurance? What are they going to think about this? It's as yet to be seen as to what they'll think about it. Obviously, there's a much higher risk of shareholder lawsuits. Shareholders have, in California, in fact, every jurisdiction allows shareholders to inspect the books and records of the company for a reason reasonably related to their shareholding, which is a pretty broad right, and they can look at everything: bank statements, financial statements, pretty much everything they want to look at, as long as they've got a proper reason for doing so. Again, there's a lot of people to manage. I think we'll see people doing crowdfunding using Delaware as a corporation rather than California, because the Delaware corporate law is much more friendly to management than most of the other states. And so I think most people are going to opt for that because the Delaware courts have been much more protective of management decisions from shareholder complaints. And of course, there are unintended consequences. I think for those of you who come and listen to Che talk, ask him, would you invest as a later stage investor in a company that had raised $1 million through crowdfunding? And I was talking to one angel investor last month, and he said, I want to touch it with a barge pole. They've got 200
Unknowns.
lunatics as shareholders. I'm coming in later, and I'm taking the risk that one of these is going to sue us. I don't think so. So
I've heard that from several people around here.
Yeah. So I think that certainly the institutional investing people and the angel investors, I think they're looking at this in a fairly jaundiced fashion and thinking these are not going to be the companies that I want to invest in. And if you're in one of these companies, that kind of begs the question as to whether you should do it. And then, if you are going to raise money this way, well, make sure you raise enough not to have to go to anybody else but this type of funding for your company. Careful what you wish for. It is something that is going to require some thought. But there's obviously an opportunity. There's a lot of people who are very active in this community. There's Crowdfunder, Early Shares, Seed Invest, Get Funded, Crowdnetic. They're popping up all over. People who are going to obviously want to make money off raising money for people using crowdfunding. you know, I think it's like an industry in search of a product. You know, and we don't have a product, but there's a lot of people walking around putting on conferences, and I'm thinking, I'm just going to wait to go to a conference until I've actually seen what the rules are. But, you know, there is a crowdfunding professionals association. There's the crowdfunded intermediary reputation advocates. There's now a European crowdfunding network. You know, these organizations are popping up all over because everybody thinks it's going to be the next greatest thing. Fear of fraud continues to persist. The SEC asked for public comments, and they're continuing to take public comments on the subject of crowdfunding legislation. I've read all of them through October, and they basically fall into two camps. One says, don't screw it up, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And the other says, this is the worst idea, and everybody's going to lose a ton of money. And there's nobody kind of in between. It's kind of interesting.
Sounds like our government.
Yeah, it does. It's interesting because the empirical data from those countries that have had this type of activity, the UK, Ireland, Netherlands, there is zero fraud. I mean, not everybody's been successful, but there hasn't been any fraud. And, you know, I put it down to the fact that the internet is essentially a village. Anybody who lives out on the web is you're going to get talked about, whether you like it or not. You know, Yelp is going to pop up, and you know, there's going to be all sorts of message boards and forums and rating systems that are just going to come up. And you know, if you screw up, your name is going to be out there, and everybody's going to know. And if you're fraudulent, you're never going to be able to hide again, and the regulators will find you. You know, it's ironic. There's a ton of fraud that already goes on. Most of it is paper, because these people set up these dummy corporations. They produce very expensive-looking paperwork with, you know, names of law firms that don't actually exist all over them. And people look at this and they say, wow, I've got a stack of documents like this. Obviously, these guys are real. And you send it back to a PO box, and that's it. They're gone. And people are falling for that at the moment, but there's nothing they can do, and they're usually too embarrassed to say something to their local FBI agent to say, oops, I fell for that one. Whereas the internet, you know, everybody's going to be talking on it. So I think the fear of fraud is probably overset. You know, you're going to get great reviews. People are going to say, these are people are good, and next time you want to do something, people will talk about it. So, you know, don't overpromise. Just over-deliver. I mean, these are basic rules in anything that you do, and I think it's just going to be an adage for here. What I do think people are going to be looking for, though, is validators. You know, they're going to be wanting somebody else to say, you weren't an idiot. And I don't know where those validators are going to come from. What I think will happen is that the portals will develop reputations for putting up investment opportunities that were good. And so the portals are essentially going to be the vetters of these. They're not endorsing them because they're not allowed to endorse them. They can't advertise them. They can just put them up. But there's going to be a bunch of these, and people are then going to talk about which ones were successful, and people are going to get reputations for picking good ones. And that, I think, is what's going to sort out the sheep from the goats. But, you know, I might be completely wrong.
Would there be a way to combine both? Saying you're raising VC money, but also crowdfunding at the same time? If you ever find a VC, that would be interesting in combining that. But basically, having the endorsement coming from the larger money coming in, and then everybody like, well, that seems like a good deal.
Yeah, I think, well, in theory, yes. In practice, it's never going to happen because VC does not want 2,000 people investing on the same terms that they're investing.
Right.
You know, it's just never going to happen. Yeah. But you know, it's the most significant piece of securities legislation since the 30s. I think we should be, you know, applauding somebody for having made it happen. We'll just have to wait and see.